Great. So let's start. Starting. Hey everyone, welcome to Healthy Mind, Healthy Life, the podcast where we explore the powerful intersections of mental health, faith, and human experience. I'm your host Avik, and today we are diving deep into the kind of conversation that doesn't just make you think, that it makes you feel, wrestle, and maybe even rethink everything you thought you knew. My guest today is Constance Hastings. So, welcome to the show, Constance.
Thank you for having me today.
Lovely, lovely. So, before we start, I'll quickly love to introduce you to all of our listeners. Dear listeners, Constance has walked a path few dare to tread. I mean, raised outside faith, educated within it, a mental health counselor outside the church, yet an ordained clergy within it. So she never meant to write about Jesus, never expected to join a church, and certainly never saw herself in formal ministry. But as she puts it, the trouble with Jesus is he doesn't let you walk away. So, with this, I'll not take much of your time. I'll quickly get into the discussion today with one and only Constance. So, welcome to the show again. Lovely, lovely. So, I mean, Constance, like your story is fascinating because it seems to be built on contradictions, growing up outside of faith, but finding yourself deeply within it. So, what was the first moment that you realized Jesus wasn't just an idea in a book, but someone who might actually be pursuing you?
I came to faith, as I sometimes say, for all the wrong reasons. My parents were not religious. My father owned a bar. They also owned a motel that they ran in the summertime at the beach. And my mother would take us to church until old enough to be just dropped off and then just left us with that. However, as I was growing up, it was during the time of the civil rights movement in the United States, and desegregation was happening within the public schools. My parents did not want to have me involved in that, so they sent me to a small independent Christian school, which was right down the street and not very expensive. Their idea was, okay, get an education. However, it was a Christian school, and the teachers there loved me. And I, after a few years, latched on to Bible study, and I excelled at it. And
Oh,
it was because of that that I learned Bible and I learned of Jesus Christ. When I
mm,
was 7 years old, an aunt took me to see a movie about Jesus. And that night, I was thinking about the movie and I was in my bed and I felt so responsible for Jesus having to die. And I felt he had to do that for me. And so I got on my knees right there in my bed and I said, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that's happened. I'm sorry you had to do this. Years later, I read Paul Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. And when Pilgrim comes to the cross and repents, this burden that he's been carrying on his journey, it just drops away. And that's the exact same feeling that I had that night. And I came to understand that that was my time and moment of salvation. And God held on to me through those years. Again, I wasn't living in a family that had any kind of deep faith, and there were contradictions between what I was learning in the Bible and what I lived at home. But God held on to me and into my adult life when I then began to uh, be in a church community and go deeper in my faith. So briefly, that's how it all came about. but not because I was pointed in any direction. It was rather that because God called to me from where I was.
That's amazing. That's really amazing. So, uh, I mean, many people listening might be exactly where you are, wrestling with doubt, maybe feeling clinical about faith. What do you say to someone who thinks that Jesus is just another historical figure, not someone who has anything to do with me today?
That's a very good question. Yeah, Jesus is often portrayed as, well, maybe he was a prophet. He was certainly a wise teacher. He gave us certain tenets to live by, which can be generally applied to all peoples in all ways, and that's nice to know. But the point of Jesus' life was that he didn't come to change the world. He came to change hearts. And through the individual hearts, then the world could change. He lived a life in which he was born into trouble. His background was that his parents, well, they weren't quite married, and they lived in a time of political oppression from the in the first century from the Romans. His birth narrative is one that shows the oppression under which they lived because the Romans had ordered a census to be taken for the purpose of taxing the Jews. And just before he was born, his family had to travel to another town. It was about a 3 days journey. And born in circumstances that, as we sometimes say, a stable, maybe even just a cave, and was relatively poor at the time. A couple years later, the king Herod heard from wise men that a new king had been born for the Jews, and later Herod sent his soldiers into this town in which his family was living, Bethlehem, to slaughter all the baby boys that were under the age of 2. God had, through an angel, warned his parents to leave, and they became refugees in Egypt. But here we are. The King of the Jews, the long-awaited Messiah, is being born, and there's a slaughter. That's the trouble in Jesus' story. And he lived a life that was in some ways contrary to what most people would think. One of the chapters in a book I've written is called "The Trouble with Jesus" was he chose losers. He gathered around him an inner circle of 12 men who really had no power, no influence. They were uh, for the most part poor. They were also oppressed. They had no way of changing the climate of the culture. And yet that's who Jesus called to support him and to teach. He valued women, and women in those days were certainly oppressed. I mean, most women had a life of either as a wife, a slave, or a prostitute. And many times, in all practical purposes, there was not much difference between the three. And yet Jesus ministered and spoke to women and used them to show of a moral and high relationship that we are to have with each other and with God. He spoke a lot about money. People don't even today don't like people being told what to do with their money. And again, it was contrary to the usual way of thinking about accumulating money, because Jesus stressed that we are blessed to be a blessing to others. And when he told the rich ruler to sell all you have and give to the poor, the man walked away. In all of these, there was a convergence in his life of the religious and the political leaders who would more or less have him gone. And when that happened, he was crucified. The thought was he was silenced and his word in ministry would be silence. But here's the choice that's given to us today. And I will say it is a choice. Jesus even said, I am the resurrection and the life.
Hmm.
Resurrection. And as we read in the record that on the third day following his crucifixion, he appeared to people, to women first, by the way, but then to his disciples and then to many, many others, and ascended into heaven. He defeated in that resurrection death. But when Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life, he said, do you believe this? And that question reverberates through millennia to where we are given that question as well, and come to a place where we have to make that choice and sit and be confronted with what God would have us know and believe through the life of Christ.
Understood. I mean, uh, I have to say, like, it's that tension between skepticism and curiosity is where so many get stuck. Yeah.
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 But
So,
if I may continue with
mhm,
that, you mentioned the tension. Yes, there is tension.
yeah,
Things in Jesus' life don't make sense. We don't know how they happen. It's a
mhm,
measure of faith and doubt, and that's the tension in which we live.
yeah,
But overlaying that has to be the understanding that all of this was done because there is this God, God of the universe, higher power, however you want to formulate that, that
mm,
had such immense love that wanted to have a real personal relationship and presence in his created beings that he put on this earth, that he made all of this possible through the part of him that we know as the Son of God.
mhm, exactly. Wow. So I'll also come on this about your book. The Trouble with Jesus doesn't offer any easy answers, and it leaves the reader with a choice. So, what do you think? Choice is important when it comes to faith, especially for those who have been burned by the religion.
For those who, as you say, have been burned by the religion, I
Mhm,
give my deep sorrow and apology. And
mhm,
as it is, the trouble with Jesus is he's been leveraged for personal and political and oppressive
mhm,
powers to have people suppressed,
mhm,
basically suppressed. And, in his time, it was through the religious leaders. They
mhm,
had taken what had been known as the law and developed it into what is it? 633 rigid rules that people had to follow, which were meant to be oppressive and to
mhm,
keep the thumb on people. And that tendency has continued again throughout the centuries. And again, people, as you said, have been burned by that. Jesus saw that and he was angry about it. And he, we have the portrayal of him in the temple, and he's throwing out the money changers. These were people who would basically rob people in order for them to be able to perform the ritualistic sacrifices that were important to their faith at that time. And Jesus hated to see these kinds of things happen. And he said, God's not like that. God doesn't do that to us. However, you mentioned choice, and that I think is key when I talk about the love of God, because love cannot be love if it's forced on someone. That is basically dysfunctional in many ways. So God comes to us and he speaks to us in our lives, in our souls with that choice, knowing that when we make that choice, that love can be fulfilled as we have love of God and love of those around us as well. So that's the difference there, and that's why choice must be crucial.
Exactly. Yeah. And you talk about God's pursuit even when you wanted to walk away. So, what does that pursuit feel like? I mean, how does one know that they are being called into something bigger than themselves?
Well, again, my life experience has been one that's, been unusual. And it was not one for which I was prepared in the beginning parts of my life. And it was not one which I'll confess I would have chosen. My goal as I was in college and first beginning to enter the workforce as an educator was to just exactly be that, to be a teacher, to give to my students the best that I could to prepare them in their lives, eventually retire and, have the good life. But in the midst of that, I sometimes refer to it as the Holy Spirit grabbing me by the throat. I had a conviction that God wanted me to serve in other ways. Now, when I was teaching, there were times when privately I would pray with my students and give them a spiritual encouragement as well as an educational foundation. And I thought God should be pretty much pleased with that. But that wasn't what happened. And it was a time in which as I approached God, I genuinely understood that there was something that God wanted me to do beyond what would just make sense for a person of my background and upbringing and, even points of salvation and growing in the faith. And that was to come to a formal kinds of ministry. I couldn't see myself in that. Again, I wasn't particularly raised in the church or anything like that. It just didn't quite make sense. However, at the time I was entering through this process in the Methodist church, there was a development of what is referred to as the Order of Deacon. And that was a ministry that would connect the church and the world. And that felt like where I was supposed to be. And as it was, I was called to a ministry and had a faith-based mental health counseling and was able to minister to, let's say, both sides of the church, those who were in the church and needed support, as well as those who came in from outside the church and also needed mental health counseling and support in that way. So that's again part of my story, but I believe that's available to anyone who honestly wants to come before God and ask for purpose in one's life.
Understood. Okay. Great. That's really, really great. So, any advice you would like to share with the listeners today?
I've talked about mental health counseling, and I've said that those who enter into mental health counseling are probably some of the most courageous people in the world. Because to do it in an authentic and honest manner is to put oneself, to examine one's life and to look into places where we need to not just improve, but to change, to reverse. It's a process that is not easy for anyone. And it means looking at parts of our lives, and we all have them, that are dark, that we tendencies and learned behaviors that we've had that need to be examined and not just improved on, but sometimes absolutely eliminated. It's tough, and you add into that, your relationships from that of your immediate family or how you were raised up, all through life. These all have had impact, and we need to always be aware of that. Counseling can help with that journey. And as I said, it's a process that is really meant for the brave, from a mental perspective as well as from the emotional, spiritual perspectives too.
Wow. Lovely. Great. So, I have to say this, like faith and mental health are the journeys and not the destinations, dear listeners. They are messy, full of questions, and sometimes full of trouble. So, but maybe, just maybe, the trouble with Jesus is exactly what makes the story worth wrestling with. And if this conversation has resonated with you, then pick up Constance's book, engage in your own questioning, and most of all, stay curious. So subscribe to Healthy Mind and Healthy Life for more raw, real, and mind-opening conversations. Also, I'll put all the links and the book links into the show notes for your easy reference. And remember that sometimes the best way forward is through the questions, not the answers. So, with this, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.